On May 2, 1945, deep in the Austrian Alps near the village of Reuter, a young German scientist named Magnus von Braun pedaled a bicycle down a mountain road, frantically waving a white handkerchief at the first American soldiers he could find. He was carrying a message from his brother. His brother, he explained breathlessly to the American private who stopped him, was Wernher von Braun, Germany's greatest rocket scientist, the man who had created the V-2 rocket, the man who had helped rain destruction on London. And Wernher von Braun wanted to surrender, not to the Soviets, not to the British, not to the French, but specifically, deliberately, to the Americans. What began with that bicycle ride in the Alps would eventually produce the Saturn V rocket that carried Americans to the moon. To understand what happened next, and why it remains one of the most morally complex and ethically disturbing stories in the history of American science, you need to understand who Wernher von Braun was. He was born in 1912 in Wiersitz, Germany, the son of a Prussian baron who served as the Minister of Agriculture under the Weimar Republic. Wernher was a prodigy who became obsessed with spaceflight as a teenager after reading science fiction, novels about journeys to other planets. He joined the German Society for Space Travel at the age of 17, became the Society's secretary and principal experimenter, and was recruited into the German military's secret rocket program before he turned 20. By 1932, von Braun was working for the German army on liquid-fueled rockets, and by the mid-1930s, he had become the technical director of the Peenemünde Army Research Center on Germany's Baltic coast, the most sophisticated and secret rocket development facility on Earth. Peenemünde was where the V-2 was born, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, the first human-made object to reach the edge of space, and the deadliest conventional weapon deployed in World War II in terms of sheer terror, striking targets with no warning and no defense. More than 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched against London, Antwerp, Paris, and other Allied cities, killing thousands of civilians. But what von Braun dreamed of was not warfare. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937. Membership was essentially mandatory for any scientist who wanted to continue his work in Germany, and he had been commissioned as an SS officer in 1940, eventually reaching the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major. He wore the uniform when ordered to, attended the functions he was required to attend, and otherwise focused his immense intellectual energy entirely on the technical problem that consumed him. How do you build a rocket that can escape Earth's gravity? The war was, in his view, an obstacle and an opportunity simultaneously. An obstacle because it forced him to weaponize his work, and an opportunity because only the enormous resources of a wartime state could fund the kind of research he needed to do. This is where the story becomes morally unbearable, because the rockets that von Braun dreamed of and built at Peenemünde were not built by paid engineers working in a comfortable facility. They were built, in their thousands, by slave labor. In 1943, as Allied bombing made Peenemünde increasingly dangerous as a production site, the SS constructed an underground factory in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, inside a repurposed salt mine beneath Kohnstein Mountain. This facility was called Mittelwerk, Central Works, and it was one of the most horrific places on Earth. The men who built the V-2 rockets at Mittelwerk were concentration camp prisoners, sourced primarily from the Dora concentration camp established directly above the tunnels. They worked in conditions of unimaginable brutality, 12-hour shifts inside tunnels where ventilation was almost non-existent, temperatures swinging wildly, dust from the construction so thick it coated the lungs. They slept in the tunnels, ate almost nothing, and were beaten to death or hanged for the slightest infraction. More than 20,000 concentration camp prisoners died at Dora-Mittelbau, a number larger than the total number of people killed by the V-2 rockets themselves. Did Wernher von Braun know? He was not at Mittelwerk every day. but he visited regularly, and the conditions there were not subtle. He witnessed the hangings. He made requests for specific workers with specific technical skills directly from the SS, which drew them from concentration camp populations. He received reports about production and efficiency that could not have omitted the central fact of what those production numbers were built upon. A French survivor of the Dora camp, who survived to old age and spent decades demanding accountability, claimed to have seen von Braun standing and watching while men were beaten. Whether that specific account is true or not, the broader picture is undeniable. Von Braun was one of the principal beneficiaries of a system of industrialized murder, and he chose to continue working within it until the very end. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany from both east and west, von Braun and his team at Peenemünde faced a decision. The Soviets were advancing from the east, and their intelligence services were also actively seeking to capture German rocket scientists. The SS had contingency plans that were deeply disturbing. There were orders, which von Braun had heard about, suggesting that the scientists might be killed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. Von Braun gathered his senior team, over 100 men, and led them on a journey south through the chaos of collapsing Germany toward the American lines in Bavaria. He made the deliberate choice to surrender to the Americans, famously explaining it to his team in the bluntest possible terms. "We despise the French. We are mortally afraid of the Soviets. We do not believe the British can afford us. So that leaves the Americans." His arrival in American custody coincided almost exactly with the discovery by American soldiers advancing through Germany of what the German rocket program had been built upon. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, insisted that American military personnel, journalists, and members of Congress come to see the concentration camps, the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the ovens of Nordhausen, so that no one could ever say they had not known. But a decision was being made simultaneously at the highest levels of the American government that would place von Braun and his colleagues entirely beyond the reach of accountability. The intelligence program that brought von Braun and more than 1,600 other German scientists to the United States was initially called Operation Overcast, renamed Operation Paperclip in November 1945. The name Paperclip came from the literal paperclips that Army ordnance officers began attaching to the folders of scientists they most wanted to recruit. A mundane office supply marking an extraordinary moral compromise. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, a subcommittee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, managed the program with extraordinary secrecy and extraordinary bureaucratic creativity. The problem was a fundamental one. Many of the scientists the United States most wanted were, by any reasonable definition, war criminals. State Department guidelines clearly prohibited the immigration to the United States of anyone who had been more than a nominal participant in Nazi activities. Von Braun himself was an SS officer who had participated in the slave labor system at Mittelwerk. Several other key scientists on the list had committed acts that were, under the Nuremberg principles, being simultaneously applied to German political and military leaders, unambiguous war crimes. The solution the JIOA developed was elegant in its cynicism. They simply altered the records. Scientists who had been identified as active Nazis in initial intelligence reports had those reports quietly rewritten. Membership in the SS was minimized or omitted. Evidence of war crimes participation was buried. President Harry Truman officially approved the expanded program on September 3, 1946, in a classified directive that authorized the importation of up to 1,000 German scientists under temporary, limited military custody. A description that obscured the program's true nature from the American public almost entirely. Beginning in September 1945, the first group of 7 rocket scientists arrived at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor, including Wernher von Braun himself. They were initially housed at Fort Bliss in Texas and at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where they immediately began working on American missile projects using their expertise from Peenemünde. Von Braun and his colleagues, who just months earlier had been designing weapons of mass destruction for the regime that operated the death camps, were now on the government payroll of the world's foremost democracy, living in comfortable quarters in the American Southwest, giving technical lectures to Army engineers, writing papers about rocket design. The cultural dissonance was extraordinary. Von Braun was charming, brilliant, spoke excellent English, was photogenic and articulate, and could speak with infectious enthusiasm about the dream of space exploration. He quickly became a figure of genuine public fascination in America. His English language publications about space travel, his collaboration with Disney on educational television films about the future of space exploration in the early 1950s, and his cover appearances in popular magazines made him a celebrity scientist before the term existed. He was the face of American ambition, the visionary pointing toward the stars. And virtually no one in the general public had any idea that he had been an SS officer who had built his career on the backs of murdered concentration camp prisoners. 1950, von Braun's team was transferred to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, which would become the center of American military rocket development for the next decade. There, von Braun and his paperclip colleagues developed the Redstone missile, America's first ballistic missile of meaningful range, and later the Jupiter missile, which could reach targets over 1,500 miles away. When the space race began in earnest with the Soviet launch of Sputnik in October 1957, it was von Braun's team at Redstone Arsenal that developed the Jupiter-C rocket that launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit on January 31, 1958. When NASA was established in 1960 and took over the Army's Development Operations Division at Redstone Arsenal, it became the Marshall Space Flight Center, and Wernher von Braun became its first director. The achievement that followed beggars description. The Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that carried American astronauts to the moon, was the most powerful machine ever built by human beings. Standing 363 feet tall, weighing 6.2 million pounds fully fueled, generating 7.6 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, the Saturn V was capable of lifting 310,000 pounds to low Earth orbit and sending nearly 100,000 pounds on a trajectory to the moon. It remains, over 5 decades later, the most powerful operational rocket ever flown. Von Braun was its architect. He oversaw its design, its testing, its iterative improvement through 12 successful flights between 1967 and 1973. On July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and said, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind," the achievement was built on foundations laid by a man who had joined the Nazi Party, worn the SS uniform, used concentration camp slave labor, and been imported to America with his crimes carefully hidden from public view. The ethical reckoning with Operation Paperclip has been slow, incomplete, and deeply uncomfortable. Von Braun died in 1977, celebrated, having received the National Medal of Science, the Distinguished Federal Civilian Service Award, and the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. Arthur Rudolph, who had been the production manager at Mittelwerk and was in many ways more directly complicit in the slave labor system than von Braun, received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal in 1969 for his role in the Saturn V program, then fled the United States in 1984, when investigators from the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations finally began looking seriously at his wartime activities. He renounced his American citizenship and returned to Germany to avoid prosecution. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, was inducted into the International Space Hall of Fame in 1978 before being removed in 2006 when documentation surfaced showing his participation in medical experiments at the Dachau concentration camp. The argument in favor of Operation Paperclip, made by its architects and its defenders ever since, rests on a straightforward utilitarian logic. The Cold War was the paramount challenge of the post-war era. The Soviet Union was aggressively recruiting its own German scientists, and the technological edge gained by bringing German expertise to America, expertise that ultimately put Americans on the moon and kept the United States ahead of the Soviets in the critical early years of the space race, was worth the moral compromises involved. The program has been estimated to have been worth $10 billion in patents and industrial processes alone in 1945 dollars. The men it brought to America were responsible not just for the space program, but for advances in aeronautics, synthetic fuels, aviation medicine, and military missile technology that shaped the entire Cold War balance of power. The counter-argument is equally clear. The United States, in the process of putting Americans on the moon, became complicit in the cover-up of war crimes, offered sanctuary and reward to men whose hands bore the blood of tens of thousands of murdered concentration camp prisoners, and sent the message most clearly to the survivors of those camps and to the families of the dead that American interests would always, in the end, trump American values. Both arguments are true simultaneously. That is the terrible, irreducible complexity at the heart of Operation Paperclip. America went to the moon on the shoulders of men who had served the Third Reich. The flag planted in the lunar dust flew above the remains of everyone who had died, in the tunnels of Mittelwerk building the weapons that made it possible. History is rarely clean, and the story of Operation Paperclip is perhaps the most powerful illustration in American history of just how dirty it can get.